So I'm going to tell you a bit about EMDR, which is a trauma therapy, an evidence-based trauma therapy. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So EMDR was created by Francine Shapiro in the 1980s, originally for treating veterans returning from the Vietnam War. And it uses bilateral stimulation or eye movements back and forth, similar to when we're in REM sleep stage. Our eyes do something similar. And what she noticed was that when she was walking around doing these eye movements and thinking about difficult things, she began to process them. So what happens is that when we use bilateral stimulation, we activate our own adaptive information processing system. So when we're traumatized, the traumatic memories tend to be stored in a part of the brain called the amygdala, where there's no sense of time, there's no perspective. So that's why when we're traumatized, we can experience the trauma as if it's happening now. So we might have flashbacks, for example. We might have the anxiety in our bodies, the raised adrenaline, the raised cortisol, the expectation that something terrible is going to happen, panic attacks. And when we treat traumas with EMDR, we're engaging both the amygdala, where the traumatic memory is stored, and the neofrontal cortex, where we have access to thinking, to perspective. And once we've done the processing, the memories are stored in a different part of the brain, the hippocampus, where there is a sense of time. So they're just memories, and they tend to lose their charge, lose their emotional charge. So we'd start the treatment by taking a trauma history. So getting a sense of what the presenting issues are, and doing an affect bridge from the current feelings, the current experience, following that emotion back to the first time that was felt. And by doing this affect bridging, we can begin to get a sense of what are the childhood traumatic experiences, if there are some, or later on in life, we get a sense of the different points of trauma. And that's important because we want to target the earliest trauma and the worst trauma, and then maybe some of the other traumas in between. And when we do that, we tend to find that that generalizes to other traumatic experiences as well. So we don't necessarily have to target every trauma. It tends to generalize, but we do check that. So some clients come with single episode traumas. An example of that might be a car accident or a sexual assault. And we would treat that episode, but we'd also check to see if there are other underlying traumas that also need treating, because we tend to become traumatized not generally because of one experience, but it's generally because of a series of experiences that seem to confirm the same thing to us. And we would then work out what is the negative cognition that is confirmed by this experience. So an example might be, I'm not good enough. And then I might have several experiences which seem to confirm this to me. So we treat those traumas, and then we'd install a positive cognition, which might be something like, I'm good just as I am, or I'm worthy, I deserve love, I'm lovable. So we tend to start the process in the positive by installing resources. So a safe place is the most common and I think the most helpful resource. So that's a place that you can go to in your mind where you can relax and rest. You might think about it as a calm place in your mind. So that may be somewhere you've been on holiday. It may be in the forest, by the beach, somewhere out in nature where you just feel like you can rest. So we'd install that as a resource so that you can go there whenever you want to, whenever you need to. And we tend to use that at the beginning and end of each session to ground you. There are other resources that we can install as well, like a wise figure. So we might take a character in literature or in a film or a public figure, a nurturing figure, somebody who's maternal, affectionate, a protective figure, somebody that might look out for you, keep you safe, somebody that you might go to when you need help. And this is helpful because some of us don't have the kind of blueprints for these type of experiences and these type of relationships. So if we can imagine these figures, and we then tend to have the feelings that we would associate with having these sort of figures in our lives, that in itself is really helpful and tends to create a new experience for us. We can also install a bespoke resource. So, if there's a particular situation coming up that's making you quite anxious and you have anticipatory anxiety, we might look at, well, what are the qualities that will be helpful for you in this upcoming situation? And when have you engaged these qualities in the past? When have you actually experienced these qualities in yourself? And can we re-engage these qualities? Or perhaps there's somebody else who embodies these qualities, and you can imagine what it's like being with them, and feeling these qualities in their presence. So once we've identified the targets and we've agreed, we look at how disturbing each traumatic memory is, and we tend to treat the most disturbing ones. And we then either use the bilateral stimulation, or we can also use a butterfly hug. And this is something you can do on your own for yourself, actually, which is really calming. It's a form of bilateral stimulation that you can do for yourself. So we'd use either of these techniques and then go in and out of the trauma in a process we call titration. Going in and out, in and out, in and out, just seeing what do you get. The question is, what do you get? There's no right and wrong about it. It's just, what are you noticing? And through this process, we tend to find that people become desensitized to the trauma. The disturbance level tends to come down to 0. We can then install a positive cognition and then clear anything that might be left in the body with a body scan. So some people who present with trauma, and particularly with complex trauma, have a tendency to dissociate. And what that means is this is actually a very early coping mechanism that we develop when we're very young. When we're faced with stress that is unmanageable and we don't have the help we need, and there's really not much we can do except dissociate, meaning kind of numb ourselves out, check out. It's an unconscious process, which basically means that we're just not really present. So that can happen when we're doing EMDR, and it's something that we would check out and carry on checking out, because we want to keep you present. And we have different ways of doing that, by getting you into the body. For example, smelling some essential oils, engaging your senses can be really helpful. Just feeling your feet on the floor and your body in the chair. Sometimes we might do something like toss a ball back and forth, or tax your working memory by asking you to count backwards by 7s, something like that. Another really important part of the treatment, and we tend to do this early on, is to bring in grounding and stabilization techniques so that you know how to ground yourself when you're becoming overwhelmed or you're finding yourself dissociating because you're overwhelmed. And an example of this is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. And that's basically looking around, noticing 5 things you can see and describing them to yourself. Noticing 4 things you can touch and actually feeling them and noticing what they feel like. Noticing 3 things you can hear and describing what those things sound like. Noticing 2 things you can smell and describing those smells. And then noticing one thing you can taste, and that might be harder, but this really engages the senses and tends to bring people back to the present, the here and now, and where there is no sense of threat. So we can treat all kinds of traumas with EMDR, as I said, single episode, complex trauma, OCD, phobias, anticipatory anxiety, sexual assault, physical assault, emotional abuse, birth trauma. And one thing I tend to say to clients before we begin doing EMDR is that EMDR does tend to stir us up a little bit, so it can make us feel worse before it makes us feel better. So that's important to know in terms of the timing, to make sure you're doing it at a time when you haven't got something majorly stressful going on in your life that you need to attend to. And just so you're aware that in between sessions, you can feel a bit more emotional, or you might have disturbing dreams, for example, because you're still processing the material in between sessions. So what tends to be very helpful, and what I always recommend, is keeping a journal and writing down any difficult dreams that you have, difficult patches emotionally, relational issues that you have, so that we can talk about them in the session. And the other thing is, it's really important to have somebody that you can speak to in between sessions, a friend, a partner, a colleague, a family member, just so that you know that there's somebody you can go to talk through things if you want. That's really helpful.